Hello class. Today we are going to be learning about the synapse. I know last class you probably had that burning question, right? We talked all about how that nervous signal goes from one end of the axon to the other, but how is it that that electrochemical signal causes your muscles to move or causes the neuron it's attached to also fire, right? How does that signal move from your neuron to something else? Well, the answer to that question involves the synapse and it involves neurotransmitters. The synapse is what occurs at the junction between the end of your axon and the thing it is acting on. Now, it always involves a presynaptic cell. In this case, well, in all cases, it's your axon terminal, the end of your axon. And your axon terminal contains neurotransmitters. That is how that signal moves from one neuron to another, how it acts upon things. It releases neurotransmitters. And it releases them here into what's called the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft is the gap between the neuron and the dendrite of another, or between your axon of a neuron and a muscle fiber. Right? So you'll have a motor neuron that's going to activate the muscle in your arm. It will have your axon terminals ending in your muscle fibers, right? So that synaptic cleft is where the neurotransmitters go from one end of a neuron to the thing it is acting on. And lastly, you have a postsynaptic cell, dendrite or muscle fiber, and this contains receptor sites for those neurotransmitters. And once those neurotransmitters bond to those receptors, well, if it's another neuron, that is a stimulus to cause sodium ion channels to open up, and as a result, sodium can rush in, and you can meet that negative 55 millivolt threshold, and an action potential can occur. Now, how does this actually happen, right? How does that electrochemical signal, when it gets to the end of your axon, how does that cause neurotransmitters to be released? Well, there's actually voltage-gated calcium ion channels at the end of your axon, and those channels, when they open up and allow calcium to rush in, that causes the exocytosis of neurotransmitters. So once that electrochemical signal gets to the end of your axon, it promotes the exocytosis of those neurotransmitters. Now, this neurotransmitter, as it diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to those receptors, that will cause the adjacent neuron or muscle fiber to fire, right, to have that action potential. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that are made in neurons, and they diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to the receptors on dendrites, muscles, or glands. And this is kind of the slow stage of nervous signal transduction, right? You have the nodes of Ranvier, that's saltatory conduction, that's extremely fast, but then the releasing the neurotransmitters by exocytosis and having them diffuse across the gap, bind to receptors, that's kind of the slow stage. It still happens extremely quickly, don't get me wrong. After binding to receptors, these neurotransmitters need to be removed, right? We don't want them to continually have their action. That would be really bad, right? If you look in the case of, for example, tetanus, let's say you step on a rusty nail, that bacteria produces a toxin that will cause your muscles to just keep contracting so violently that it can actually cause your bones to break, right? We need to reuptake these neurotransmitters because we want their effect to only be a part of that action potential, not to be lingering. So how do we do that? Well, we can reuptake these neurotransmitters so into the presynaptic cell, right? So we can reuptake them. Usually this is done via receptor-mediated endocytosis, something like that. Or we can degrade them by enzymes. Now this is another common approach our body uses. To help you remember, I'll give you a good and interesting example.
Messages at the front for Ms. Smith and Mr. Halstead.
If you look in South America, there's certain shamanistic rituals which involve something called ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a very, very powerful hallucinogenic drink. Now, interestingly, the active ingredient DMT, your brain also produces during REM for sleep, the deepest stage of sleep. So when you are in your deepest stage of sleep, your brain is producing the most hallucinogenic substance on earth. So why is it that when you wake up, you aren't vividly hallucinating? Why is that? Well, that's because your brain produces enzymes that break down the neurotransmitters released by DMT. DMT has a fairly short active lifespan in your body. Now, when you mix that with an MAO inhibitor, all of a sudden, now you aren't having that same breakdown of neurotransmitters that occurred due to this drug, DMT, and this effect, which would have only lasted for 5 or 10 minutes, now lasts for 7-8 hours, right? So in these shamanistic rituals, you can vividly hallucinate for an extremely long time. And it wouldn't have been that long if your brain wasn't being inhibited from breaking down those neurotransmitters. So what are the neurotransmitters? Well, we have dopamine. Dopamine is a big one. This produces feelings of pleasure and euphoria. If you don't got enough of it, that is Parkinson's disease. Now, you don't want too much of it either. When we find too much, that's characteristic of schizophrenia. You need a balance of dopamine in your brain. Obviously, many drugs take advantage of dopamine, right? They cause a massive flood of dopamine. And that flood of dopamine makes you feel really good, but the issue with that is it is very addictive, and if you stop doing certain drugs that cause that dopamine rush, your brain no longer has that ability to produce dopamine to adequate levels without the drugs. So you go through crazy withdrawals. You see this like with heroin, for example. Right? You're abusing heroin, you're riding the high that comes from all that dopamine being produced, but over time, your body becomes accustomed to all of that dopamine release. You don't have the same amount being released, so you need to up the dosage. And if you try to quit heroin, your brain will be extremely dopamine starved, and you will feel the worst you've ever felt in your entire life. Right? Withdrawal is a horrible experience, so don't do drugs. Epinephrine, another important neurotransmitter. Another term for this is adrenaline, and this acts on the sympathetic nervous system, right? It initiates as part of that fight or flight response. Another one is serotonin. Serotonin is very important in sleep regulation and mood. We find a shortage of serotonin within people that are depressed. They will often be prescribed drugs that inhibit the breakdown of serotonin. I think they're called SRIs. Or the reuptake. Yeah, I think they're serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they stop the reuptake of serotonin, leaving that serotonin in the synaptic cleft for longer, and therefore elevating that person's mood. Again, you need to be careful with antidepressants because they are also addictive. And then you have acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the first of the neurotransmitters to be discovered, and this is the one that acts at neuromuscular junctions. Now, it activates muscles. Here we have a photo of kind of before and after of Botox. Now, who here knows what Botox is? Right, it's the thing that gets rid of the wrinkles, but how does it get rid of the wrinkles? Believe it or not, they are injecting the world's deadliest toxin into their faces. Botox comes from a bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, that produces the botulinum toxin. It is the deadliest toxin on Earth by a large amount. How does it kill you? Well, it kills you if you were to ingest it. Let's say you have an old can on the shelf, it's all swollen, you open it up, it smells really bad, and you're like, meh, still good. You pound back that can, and really gross too. You may die of botulinum poisoning. Now, the way you die is that toxin actually stops that signal, the acetylcholine, from being able to activate your muscles. So in essence, it paralyzes those muscles. Right? I think it blocks receptors. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure it blocks the acetylcholine receptors. So in essence, those muscles cannot actually work any longer. So it paralyzes those respiratory muscles. You stop breathing, you die. Now, this is great if you want to get rid of wrinkles. You can paralyze those facial muscles, and as a result, it gets rid of those wrinkles. But again, I would highly recommend you do not do this. You are injecting the world's deadliest toxin in your face and paralyzing muscles. So keep that in mind. Now, that is just a couple of the neurotransmitters. We're not going to go over all of them. There's a lot of them, right? This is, again, just a small sample. I haven't even touched on like the endocannabinoid system, the system in which THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, acts on. There's, I haven't talked about all the different types of receptors there are. There's a lot going on here, right? Your brain is a very complex animal. We just don't have time to talk about all of them. So, what is a drug? Well, a drug is a substance that affects the functioning of the brain and the body. And it affects the communication of information between neurons and between neurons of other cells of the body. Often drugs will cause the release of dopamine, for example, stop maybe its reuptake. There's many different modes of action, but when we're talking about the recreational drugs, the feel-good drugs, a lot of them revolve around the pleasure center of the brain, right? That's why people do them. And they often revolve around messing with the different amounts of neurotransmitters present within your brain. Now, some drugs are really, 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 really bad. Like meth, for example. Meth is the most addictive drug on Earth. Very highly addictive because it does target those pleasure centers in the brain. It keeps you up for days. It's horrible for your body in every way. Probably the worst drug ever to be introduced to society. And I have a friend that's a police officer, and the meth epidemic in Winnipeg is actually getting worse and worse every year. Super, super important. Never do meth. Meth is horrible for you. It is probably the worst of all the drugs. Now, how do drugs have the effects they do on your body and your brain? Well, some of them can inhibit or increase the release of neurotransmitters. Some can block the reuptake or degradation of neurotransmitters, right, causing them to stay in your synaptic cleft for longer. Some can actually bind to receptors on dendrites and act as pseudo-neurotransmitters. For example, cocaine here, if we look, this here, the dopamine transporter, the thing that will translocate dopamine from your synaptic cleft back into your neuron, right, the thing that's going to reuptake that dopamine, becomes blocked by cocaine. So as a result, well, what's going to happen? you're going to have more dopamine in that synaptic cleft because it's not being reabsorbed into the presynaptic cell. And as a result, this neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, is going to fire a lot more. And as a result, you're going to get feelings of euphoria and happiness. Now, what is the downside of all of these drugs? I've talked about it already, but you form a dependence when you're messing with these neurotransmitters within your mind, right? If your presynaptic cell, your synaptic cleft is full of dopamine all the time, well, your brain now is going to downregulate the amount of dopamine being produced, and without these drugs present, well, heck, you're going to feel like crap because these cells are no longer being activated because you're not going to be releasing as much dopamine. So you get accustomed to these drugs, you form a tolerance to these drugs by your brain stopping the production of dopamine, and when you stop doing them, it takes a long time for your brain to ramp up that dopamine production yet again. So withdrawal is a major concern, and it's why people have such a hard time quitting these drugs that affect their pleasure and reward centers of the brain. They form a physical dependence to them. So that is it for this unit. That is it for the course. So it's been a pleasure teaching all of you. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. Just as a reminder, we are currently open and receiving appointments to students. So if there's any questions you had about maybe next year, about grade 12 bio, or anything in this course, feel free. Just let me know. We'll make an appointment and we can meet at any time during regular school hours. Have a wonderful day, everyone.